Iran continues to claim that its nuclear proliferation is for energy. Obviously, the Western world believes that it's for a wartime convenience. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I will just ask a very simple question. If your intents are truly what you claim to be, why all this hiding? Why all this lack of transparency? Why all these shenanigans? Why all this dubious, hiding and concealing and lying and being deceitful, which is a matter of evidence and documented from not just a few years ago where it became a central issue, but from the very beginning. I mean, it's not just the fact that transparency is a matter, it's also the nature of the beast that is important. Let's not forget one thing. The very same countries who today are so eagerly bringing about the question of the proliferation of nuclear technology and the intents of the regime had no problems dealing with Iran before this regime in selling us the very same technology that has been denied. Why? Because clearly this regime, what it has done, its track records, its intent, its lack of transparency is cause for great alarm.
Do you have any involvement with either the British or the United States government over the years? Does anybody pull to your knowledge and experience and say, hey, how can you help, or we could use your help?
Well, part of my responsibility has been to share my thoughts and the sense of assessment and analysis to various countries and their representatives.
Who have you spoken with directly?
Well, I mean, I've talked to members of Congress, I've talked to members of the Parliament, the European Parliament, the House of Lords in Britain, and so on and so forth, politicians, ambassadors, people who are involved in all facets of politics and decision-making in the outside world, particularly in the Western world.
Is anybody working on removing the Iranian government, the mullah, right now? That's a plan that we don't know about. Would you be involved in anything? Do you see a role returning to Iran and doing something?
Well, look, first of all, I don't think that the question of regime change should be posed by anybody other than the Iranian people themselves. It's not the business of any foreign government to advocate that. However, what I'm trying to say is when you know now that the majority of the Iranian people do not want this regime anymore, then it behooves the world to say, how can we bring that change about outside of scenarios that are much more dire in consequence, certainly far more costly to both sides, and at the end of the day, far less legitimate. When you have the potential of change being brought from within, when you know that millions of Iranians are committed to it, when you see indications of the regime crumbling, when you are witnessing recently serious elements that tell you that we are not far from the end, when the bazaar is beginning to have strikes, and that's a factor in those who are close students of Iran's political evolution know that once the bazaar gets into it, you can smell that it's really getting near the end. And it has happened as of last June, a few weeks ago. This is a momentum that is right in front of our eyes. And what I've been saying to these diplomats, politicians, decision makers, policy makers has been that you have one option today on the table that we may not have had before. And failing to give this option a chance will be historically criminal, particularly if you're gearing up to some kind of confrontation down the line, which may become inevitable if we run out of this option while there's still time. So therefore, there's a sense of urgency, and I think the Iranian people can only benefit from more attention to the subject and let them feel and know that they are the instrument of change, and they are to decide what's good for them at the end. And if the world is true in its statement that we stand by people's sovereign rights to decide for themselves, let's end up with a process where we put an end to this regime, call for free and fair elections, and let the ballot box determine what should be the future of Iran.
Finally, speaking of regimes, many have argued, obviously, over the years that your father, the Shah of Iran, and his father ruled Iran in an overwhelmingly tyrannical fashion and oppressed the people. Yet so many Persians I speak with here in Southern California, and so many others say that the Shah of Iran, your father, was the greatest thing ever for Iran, and we would have never had these problems had he not been taken out of power. Where does the reality lie from one end of the spectrum to the other?
Well, I leave that assessment to history and historians. My focus has always been on the future. But at the end of the day, if you were to ask a simple question, where was the Iran going before the revolution? and which direction has it been going since then? I think the obvious answer is we were moving forward, whereas now we've regressed. And we simply want to get back on the path of moving forward, but with many differences that never existed before or we never had the opportunity to implement before. I think the degree of maturity, savvy, experience, knowledge acquired through sweat and tear, as they would say, makes our country a very good candidate today to be perhaps the first legitimate post-Islamic regime, post any other scenarios of a secular democracy, to bring in that element of stability and peace and prosperity that is long overdue for our entire region, but also I think in the sense of being in the interest of the free world. Provided that the world finally decides to understand that if nations like us are not given the opportunity to truly prosper beyond being just consumer societies, that it's not that element of keeping us only to that level when you can sell us stuff and not beyond that, then you're going to have a problem. Then we should not be astonished that we have radical extremists here and there banging their drums of saying, you see, we're still living under tyranny of Western imperialist forces and so on and so forth. If we want to move beyond that, then I think we have to level with societies that demand that right, and that's another thing that I'm championing. So whatever it is that we learned in the past century, whether under this regime or the previous regime, ought to be a good lesson to today's generation. And I don't think that the kids in Iran today, at least to the extent of my knowledge, because I'm constantly interacting with them, they are miles ahead in terms of where they want to go, what they have learned, what they're not going to fall into as a trap again. And I can only feel good about the prospects for my country, provided that they are empowered. And that's really the missing ingredient here. And that everything hinges upon that. You have the opportunity to have people who are committed to these ideals win, or you could let them down and guarantee that these forces of darkness will continue spreading the hatred, the radicalism, the extremism that has brought us to a point of experiencing the 9/11 disasters and so on. If we don't want to avoid that, and without having to endlessly be there for America to have its soldiers killed on foreign soil and what have you, and the cost it takes for the whole world, the best way to resolve all these matters, to bring this to an end, to usher in an era of cooperation, stability, is to, again, give those people a sense of sovereignty and liberty, and they will become your natural allies, as opposed to having to worry whether or not Mr. Ahmadinejad has the intention to pull the trigger one of these days. That's what I'm talking about. So that ought to be the collective focus of all of us, and that has been my mission in life. I'm not running for office. I'm trying to liberate my country.
Prince Reza Pahlavi, thank you so very much for being with us.
Thank you.
In Newport Beach at the Orange County World Affairs Council Conference, I'm David Nazar reporting.